Hello, let's get this underway. So today I am going to kind of cover some of the stuff that's covered in this book that I wrote a few years ago. It was a book that I wrote when I was working for an American company, as well as considering the direction that uh, the mountain training was going with coaching qualifications. So it kind of has within this book there has some sort of Americanism stuff and some stuff that was used in the UK kind of coaching stuff. Um, on top of this, you can buy that book via Amazon. There is a free copy on my Discord server, which I will put a link in the somewhere. But I also, in the past, has written this book. This is Rockfax bestseller, I believe, now. Snowdonia Mountain Walk and Scrambles. It's going to have its second edition printed soon. If you'd like to support us, you can buy this. You can you get the Rockfax app. And another thing I wanted to do is I actually just found, like you do, a box of quite a few of these upstairs. So at some point during this live stream, I will kind of explain how you'll have to get this. So what I'm trying to do is get more people to join my Facebook page. So if you want a free copy of this, you're going to have to keep watching. And at some point, I'll tell you how to go about that. But the main thing is today we're going to talk about the coaching process, and basically it might suit you if you want to become a better teacher, but it will also suit you if you wondering how you might best learn these things. And so I've just got, sorry, I have to find the right bit of thing. So okay, what we're going to cover is some basic teaching and learning theory, sort of a bit of the psychology of learning, how, because we're teaching in adventure sports, how anxiety can have effect on learning, the various ways that people learn, the stages of learning and effective practice, observation, analysis, and feedback. And I'm not going to talk about reflective practice because I've done a couple of, like last week I did one on reflective practice. So first of all, what I tend to do when I was giving this sort of presentation is talk about within the UK, we often consider that there is a guide, an instructor, and a coach. Now, guides tend to focus on getting people up and over mountains. That said, I know that the latest British Mountain Guides training has like a specific kind of coaching processes course involved in it. Similarly, instructors, so people doing their RCI or the MCI, will have some little aspects of teaching involved in that. And the coach, who is, is now the climbing coaches that the BMC do. I haven't done that. I did a master's degree in applied sports science with effective coaching, performance physiology, and sports psychology. And so a lot of what I am doing is going to kind of bring out what I learned on this course like over 10 years ago. I did it back in 2010. So basically this is what we're talking about in the middle is all of these people do similar jobs, and depending on what you want, different people will be able to focus on different things. So in terms of like the most basic model of learning, I often use this. It's often referred to as the Dunning-Kruger effect. I call it like just like a learning curve of that. People often who are unconsciously incompetent at something struggle to understand that they are crap at something. So they think they're better than they are. They then become consciously incompetent and their performance goes down. And then as they become consciously competent, their kind of performance go up. And when they hit unconsciously competent, and then I'm going to use this, 10,000 hours or 10 years of deliberate practice, which is a thing that people have looked into, and it's how you become elite at what you do. The other most simple plan is whenever you're kind of trying to learn something, what we're doing is going through like this plan, do, review, and we go round in circles. Oh dear, I think, did I turn it back up? Oh, I did turn it back up. I had a horrible feeling I hadn't turned the mic back up. But actually, it's a lot more complicated than that. I kind of suggest that it's like a learning spiral in my first book, How to Climb Harder, in that you do plan, do, review, plan, do, review. And occasionally, as you go around and you're kind of sparring outwards, you do the review and then you go back and you relearn something because, you know, if you think learning is linear, I don't think it is. It's like you kind of have to sometimes jump in and bring things up to speed. So the other kind of more kind of comes from more of a teaching background. This is like the accelerated learning cycle. So the idea is you create a supportive learning environment, you try and connect with people with prior learning, you explain the learning outcomes, you introduce new information, there's some activity, you get people to demonstrate that they're learning, i.e. that they have done it, and then review the activity and then go around it again. These are all fairly basic models, along with this one, which is the ideas model of teaching, which basically says you should introduce, demonstrate, explain, allow some kind of action, and then summarize the lesson. Now, this is like the basic of basic models. You introduce it, you demonstrate it, you explain it. This is the one thing that the client does, and then you summarize the lesson, which you can get them involved with, but it's you summarizing. And so one of the reasons that this is seen as quite basic, but a very good starting place for people, is that out of these 5 bits, only one of them is aimed at the client. So this is a little bit more. So we explain and demonstrate. The student imitates it. We correct them, and then the student tries again. So there's a couple of more bits that are in this edict model. So explains, demonstrate, imitates. There are lots of models like this. This is another one, which is you get them to watch, you do something, you then analyze it, feedback, set a task, and perform. And often, yeah, it's hard to explain, but there are essentially key building blocks. One is a kind of an intro. One is you demonstrating the student activities. 2 is corrections, which would include like you analyzing and giving feedback, and then summary and conclusion. And the idea is it's probably more that we can do in the student activity corrections, the better. And there was a French filmmaker, I can't remember his name, it was Jean something or another. He suggested that every film should have a beginning, a middle, and an end, but not necessarily in that order. And I'm a big believer that, you know, you can coach anybody with these things, and the more you put into the actual student, the more that they're going to learn. So I might, you know, introduce something, demonstrate it, get the students to do activities, and then correct activity, correct activity, correct activity. And I'd go around that loop as many times as I felt until I got them to where I want them, and then I'd summary, conclusion, and then I'd move on to the next thing. And how long I go through the corrections and student activity is often, I want them to be making progress. As soon as they stop making progress or they plateau, I would then move on, so people don't stagnate with the ideas. And so what I want you to understand is that, yeah, these are like the fundamental building blocks, and how you build up is often up to you. The thing with this WASP, edict, and ideas is if you follow them strictly, you know, you explain a skill, they action, and then you summarize, then you give feedback. There is no kind of path forward, which is why when you start playing around with it and seeing what works and what doesn't, you can get better at it. And one of the reasons we have all of these components is that there are 3 pathways through which we suggest people will learn. One is they learn through seeing people do it. One is they learn through audio, which could be hearing me talk, reading something I've written, and kinesthetic is them doing it through doing. Now, there used to be this idea that different people had different pathways. The reality is everybody can learn through all these different pathways. Some people might have a preferred method for a preferred skill, but you need to cover all these bases, because generally we're very rarely just teaching one person, and we want to get the effects for you know, for who that person is. So you might be able to gather it through clues, like the visual person will look and maybe ask to see the demo again. You know, an audio person might listen to the explanation and ask further questions. And the kinesthetic person will probably be trying to do the thing as you're demonstrating it. And it can be annoying, but sometimes we just have to let them get away with it. So when we give out introductions and explanations, there are a few key components that there need to be in them. One is they need to be concise, and that is because there is this limit that we're going to come across in a minute, which is that we have the ability to process 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information before we become overloaded. And that is the most important thing. The other thing is it often allows us to give an overview of what the skill is and where it fits into the bigger picture. So, you know, we might be doing something that seems very minor, but is very important to the bigger picture. And often getting people to understand the bigger picture helps them, you know, take on board the learning a lot more. So the demonstrations should be done in silence, so that there is, you know, all you're giving them is a visual information. Then should be a near perfect example, and preferably done in real time. There might be issues where if something's going really fast and you need to break it down, then that might be an issue. But generally in climbing, we want everything done in real time. So this student activity needs to be long enough. Like I say, I will go through and give people enough time so that they are getting better. But as soon as they start to reach a plateau, I want to move them on, because A, if they aren't making progress, they tend to get frustrated, and B, if I move it around a bit, it has other benefits. So if I change what I'm teaching, it would be seen as augmenting the practice, i.e. if I'm making you do like practice rockovers or practice belaying, and I've got you to near perfect, actually you want to stop somebody doing it, get them to do something else so they actually forget about what they're doing. And we're going to cover this in a bit more detail later on, but it's called augmented practice. It means basically allowing people to forget, so they have to reconstruct the idea. If you are actually coaching people, you need to observe the practice, because the idea is we're going to give feedback to help them perfect it. So often that means being in the right place and stuff like that. And the practice needs to be effective, and we're going to go into sort of like what effective practice means for different people. So somebody starting out will have a different practice regime to somebody that's an expert, and then somebody that's sort of halfway in between needs a different thing. So we'll cover into how we can change the practice that we're setting up. Feedback and corrections, it needs to be based on observation. So you need to observe to make sure that the person has, you know, it's an ongoing issue rather than a one-off mistake. It seems pointless to waste your time improving a one-off mistake. We could give that feedback verbally, visually, or kinesthetically, or all three. Again, we have to be concise because we've got that 7 plus or 2 minus chunks of information. So often you might want to just sometimes forget about one thing, because actually what we're doing is focusing on another. And we also need to give the students time to process what they have done, and make sure that they're ready for their feedback. If somebody's really frustrated at something, often giving them feedback is, you know, they're just not going to listen. And finally, you need to make sure that if you are giving feedback, that the person you've given that feedback to has time to re-practice it, and you to have a look at it to make sure that they are actually improving. So for me, often the summary conclusions I do, I reiterate what they achieved. I often would get people to go through um, and I might get them to go through chronologically what we've done in a day. This would be my a conclusion to the end of my day. So, the conclusion to the end of activity might be, I reiterate what they've achieved, where it fits into the bigger picture, how they can continue to develop that skill, and try and find a positive note on the end, because there's an essential rule of like psychology that any behavior that is rewarded will become stronger. So it's better to reward good behavior than punish bad. But finally, when I'm giving reviews, I could give it, or I can ask my students. So I might get them to kind of tell me what we've done chronologically during a session. And then I go back after they've listed it chronologically and bring out all of the teaching points, like, okay, we did this first, but and we've gone through a section of a day or even a whole day. And then I get them to tell me what the key learning parts are, with the idea that rather than me give the summary conclusion, I can pass that on to my students to do. One thing that I would recommend that you do if you are looking at becoming or developing your coaching is I would set this out, because these are like 3 of the very basics, bread and butter of any rock climbing instructor. We have to teach 1 million people to belay, tie in with a figure of 8 and put a harness on. What I want you to try and do is just have a go at practicing by yourself, in front of a mirror, video yourself if you want to give yourself to see how it goes, and using the ideas models or the edicts model or the WASP model, go into teaching belaying, tying a figure of 8 and putting a harness on. But be really strict. You're only allowed to do 1 ideas, 1 demonstration, 1 explanation, 1 action, 1 thing. And similarly with this, and then maybe think, how could you do it with just using the key components here, in any order. And so, yeah, feel free to stop the thing and carry on. So the other way we learn is, and it's the one thing I get people to do when I'm doing this, is that, you can make lots of little balls out of paper, or if you have 10 balls and a sort of a waste paper basket or a bin, and what you can do is we could practice having 10 throws underarm, 10 throws sidearm, 10 throws overarm. And if you look at it like that, what I've just done is set up some practice. I've told you you're going to do 10 underarm, 10 sidearm, and 10 overarm. And what we're trying to do is, that would be called serious practice. I've got you to do one thing 10 times, another thing 10 times, and another thing 10 times. And so we're going to get into how this setting up practice can help how we learn. So the basic science behind it is that we have this short-term sensory store, which is basically what we're seeing, what we're hearing, what we're smelling, what we can feel in our hands. We're taking in all this information at once, and essentially there's a bit of our brain that is dealing with that, and then it filters it into what we call short-term memory. And this is where we have a very discrete limit of 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. We'll talk about chunking later. And then that then goes into your long-term store, which is a massive store of information. It often stores stuff autobiographical, semantical, sequential, chronologically. Yeah. And so when we've put something into our long-term memory, we actually need to, if we just kind of practice something. So if I threw that ball overhand 10 times, what I'm doing is throwing it overhand, throwing it overhand, throwing it overhand, throwing it overhand, throwing it overhand. And I'm just looping through this short-term sensory store and short-term memory. At no point have I put it to my long-term memory. Similarly, when I do the underarm, 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 I'm just going through this. And what we're wanting to do is push information from short-term memory to long-term memory, then reconstruct and elaborate on it here as we put it back into short-term memory and perform the thing again. Now, we'll come into this a little bit more because it gets complicated, but let's just look at this thing. If I put this up for like 10 seconds and ask you to remember it, the chances are, now I've left it, you're not going to remember it. You know, if I ask you to write down that, and the reason is this is way longer than the 9 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. However, if we then say that, you know, TWA used to be an airline, A is FBI, and boy and girl backwards was what this is, you would probably much more easily remember it. And that's the example of chunking. And so in climbing, you know, to start off with, people belaying would be like, take the rope in, lock the rope off, and swap back to the beginning. Or other people might use, like, they do a V to the knee, 1, 2, 3. V, you know, one is describing what you're doing, so take in the rope, lock it off, hand swap. But the other one is giving you kind of what I would call, might be called instructional, sort of self-talking, that you make a V and then you go to your knee and then you go 1, 2, 3 and back to the beginning. And so there's things like that. There's things like, you know, you might, you know, there's a lot of things that go on that actually eventually they'll just become climbing. You know, you might be trying to find where the route goes, find where to place gear. And actually after a while, it all becomes a lot more simple. So the other important thing for us climbing is anxiety in learning, in that we will often be teaching people in a risky environment. And so there's a few models. The first is the catastrophe model, which suggests that as anxiety and adrenaline, so this is how worried we are in our brain, and this is arousal with adrenaline, our performance goes up to a point when it falls off the edge of a cliff and we have a performance catastrophe. This was one of the early models. There has been various things to address that. The first of which is called the ironic effect. And it might be, if I say, don't press that red button, people are more likely to press it. If I say, don't worry about the massive drop below you, people are going to worry about the red drop. And the way that it was researched was people were asked to think about not to think about a red VW Beetle. And what they found is there was like some suppression and repression, and whenever you ask them not to, they thought more of it. And so they then looked at, like, say, don't think about the white beetle, but instead think about a red beetle, think about a white polar bear. Again, there's science involved in that. The other one was conscious processing, often referred to paralysis by analysis. It's a reversion from autonomous processing to conscious processing. And so it's more likely to hit somebody that's an elite player. In that somebody that's at an elite or a high level will be doing the sport subconsciously. You know, they don't actually have to think it through, but they get into such a head muddle that they essentially revert to being a beginner. On my Discord server, I've put a link in there to an amazing article. You can search it online. It's by Malcolm Gladwell, and it's Fear of Failure, and it tells this amazing story of Martina Hingis, I think it is, who in one of the Wimbledon uh, finals, she was 2 points away from winning Wimbledon. 2 points away. And she just suddenly she went from winning 2 points away to not actually being able to hit the ball back over the net. It is, if you go and watch this is on YouTube. If you go and watch it, it is harrowing. She's gone from like this person that's about to win Wimbledon. She's been destroyed by this paralysis by analysis, and she's trying to overthink everything, and she barely gets another serve in and goes on to lose it. The game finishes, whoever her opponent, I think it might be Graf, wins. And at the time, I think it was the Princess of Kent. I've forgotten her name. She was in Wimbledon a lot. And they just hug Markina Hingis, who is in utter bits. Hingis does come back years later and win Wimbledon. But if you want to see conscious processing in action or read a little bit more about it, there's an interesting article by Malcolm Gladwell, who's an amazing author. Again, I quite like his book Blink. It's about decision making. It's quite good. I should add that conscious processing has been tested in a climbing environment. They've made people climb a low boulder and a high boulder, exactly the same boulder at different heights, and they found that people had to make more probing moves. They took longer, and they just showed that this happened. Processing efficiency theory is can affect people lower down the spectrum because it works on the idea that the brain is like a computer with only a limited number of cores. Again, we're going to go with our 7 plus or minus 2 cores of information or chunks of information. And the more windows that are open and the more that are kind of filled with anxiety and fear, the slower our processing becomes. And so in order to succeed in the task, what we start doing is engaging with more physical effort to overcome the effects of performance. And again, this has been tested in climbing, and there's a, I think it was years ago, just before I went to university, this was tested at Bangor University and shown to what function in climbing. So the question is then what can make people anxious? Often it can be a new or challenging environment, the height, it could be us the teacher, it could be new skills, it could be other people. There's so many things that can make people anxious. And so often we have to get to know our clients and what they're doing. And by helping them cope, there's this idea that we can mood and behavior. So, if somebody's excited and happy, they could feel nervous, but you can maybe reframe that to actually you're excited. But again, these thoughts, moods, behaviors, and sort of our body position and stuff, what's going on, heart rate, can affect how we feel. So there is more to this. I think I'm going to focus on I have a much better approach for dealing with anxiety called it's all about self-confidence. Is a really good thing, and I've got an actual whole PDF on that from an article I wrote years ago, so I'll do that at another time. So in order to manage anxiety, what we want to do is try and manage the environment we put people in. So we want to progress often small and easy to, hard and small, easy and higher, harder and higher to easy and higher. And, it could be from bouldering to single pitch to multi-pitch, from sport to trad. It doesn't matter. What we're trying to do is there are certain things we might want people to be dealing with anxiety. If they're learning to lead, they actually need to learn to deal with anxiety. So putting them in that environment is important, but we might put them on a top rope first so that they can try leading something, placing gear on a top rope, so they don't fry their brain instantly. We can talk to them and try and reassure them. Often I find trying to mirror the behavior I want. So if they're kind of like getting a little stressed, if I'm teaching lead, I'm usually hanging on a rope next to people, and I might be like, you're on a ledge, just sit down and relax the shoulders, big breathe out. And actually, what you're trying to do is teach them a method that will help them stay relaxed. It might include keeping them on the blunt end, or anything like that. Come back. So the way that this sort of affects learning, anxiety will start to clog up these 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information, which basically means that we can teach people even less. So remember when we were talking about being concise and brief and to the point on introductions, explanations, feedback, if your client is, brains just exploded with fear, eyes are out on stalks and they're hyperventilating, they aren't going to be listening to you. So you have to take them right back and calm them right down. But essentially, the more we can get students to chunk, the better. So how do we get people to chunk? It's not just trial and error. It's not just repetition. It's what I'm going to refer to as effective practice. And this is what is important for us as coaches to set up when we're getting people to do things. There's this not an oxymoron. There's this saying, practice makes perfect. But this John Fazey, who was a lecturer at Bangor, I think, in the 80s, came up with the phrase, practice does not make permanent, only perfect practice makes perfect. It takes about 50 to 100 repetitions of an individual move to learn it. So like it would take you 50 to 150 repetitions of belaying to actually learn just belaying. And so, that's a sort of how many times we're having to practice stuff. And then there's this, it takes 10 years or 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. Now, a lot of people forget this deliberate practice when it comes to performing. So that's the equivalent of 3 hours of deliberate practice a day for 10 years. So it asks, what is deliberate practice? So in terms of that 10,000 years, what we're looking at is practice that includes setting specific goals. So we as coaches can help people set specific goal for that activity. That person needs to obtain immediate feedback. It can be from themselves, but in terms of coaches, we're giving the immediate feedback. And what we want to do is focus on the technique that they're doing rather than the outcome. So if I'm teaching somebody to do a rock over and they rock over, but then they can't stand up, actually, I would reward that, because if they've rocked over and to balance on their foot and then it's just the standing up they can't do, they've got the technique down. And so what we want to do is this idea that we want to focus on the processes and techniques rather than, you didn't, you did a rock over, but you didn't make it up a 6A, you failed. We're not into that. We're into, you've got to think of ways to reward the good methodologies that we're trying to teach. We can help people as the coach fit into this. We set up the practice regimes and we need to set them up to be appropriate for who we're teaching. And the reason this gets a little complicated is that it will change depending on the activity, the levels of learning, and the complexity of a task as to what and how we set up. So I've already talked about, if I throw the ball, I want you to do 10 overarm, 10 sidearm, and 10 underarm. That would be the series practice we've done. This thing, number 1, number 2, number 3. I could then make it varied practice. So I could go, right, I want you to do one underarm, one overarm, one sidearm, and repeat through that. And that is a lot more effective, because rather than doing underarm, 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 when I'm just keeping the underarm throwing in my short-term memory going like this, and it's not going short-term, long-term, back into short-term and out, the varied practice starts to make you think, okay, I've gone underarm, I'm going to go sidearm next, and then overarm. Better still is random practice. So this time I might go, right, you're going to go underarm, and I might not tell you what you're going to do until you pick up the next ball, and then I'll go sidearm, and I might choose a totally random order. And the idea is that if I make it totally random, you could throw 30 balls with like method 1, 2, and 3. Yeah, underarm, sidearm, overarm. But actually, theoretically, you've only had essentially one go, because you've just gone the same. What this series is good for is when somebody's totally new to something, it gets them in the ballpark of the activity of what we're looking for. Varied and random practice helps us to start doing the short-term into long-term memory. And if you do random, and I did 10 throws of each method, I would almost get 30 separate practices, because I should never be keeping the underarm, overarm, sidearm in my short-term memory. I'm always having to retrieve it. The other one is augmented practice, which is you do something, you rest, you do something else, you rest. So a really good example of this would be, if I'm getting people to start belaying, I'd have somebody belaying, somebody backing up the belayer, and somebody climbing. So I've got 4 activities there. The person backing up the belayer can actually observe the person learning. It's called observational learning. The person doing the belaying is doing the belaying, and they're doing a load of serious practice. And the person climbing is having the rest. And so as you swap round, the bit that you're wanting them to learn, which is the actual belaying, they're having sort of some downtime in between, and also some extra processing. So this is helps us get people to learn better, because again, this rest, this augmenting of the practice, is stopping people keeping it in short-term memory and forcing it to go to long-term memory. A final form of practice is bilateral, in that you need to practice left and right. This was, again, I also suggest to people to go up and down. So if you're traversing, go left and right. If you're going climbing, you can go up and down. But bilateral practice was looked at when they looked at like teaching people to canoe roll. They actually found that if they got them to practice on their non-dominant side as well as their dominant side, that actually became a much more bomber roll than before. The final bit is, when I said that I was setting up and I would have somebody belaying, somebody climbing, and somebody backing up, and that person can observe. There has been studies that show that if you have paired or group learning, it's more effective. It's called observational learning, in that often when you get people that are learning to try something, they're going to make similar mistakes, and often the person who's watching will be doing their own observation and analysis and breaking everything down in order to develop their own skill. And the really interesting thing, if you're into how all of these things were researched, this one was researched on, have you seen people climb up ladders where it's just like not an A-frame ladder, like just the ladder without leaning, so you have to kind of counterbalance. And what they did is they had people go into a room and just try it and learn it, and then they got another cohort of people that came in and they did it in pairs. So one person would have a go, then the other person would have a go, and it showed that the observational learning was much more effective than just just solo learning. again, this augmented practice allows students time to rest and think and actually forget, i.e. move that idea out of short-term memory into long-term memory. And this forces them then to retrieve the information from long-term memory. This retrieval is often considered, they often look at it as called the reconstruction or the elaboration hypothesis, in that that is how we're learning, is we're taking that last idea, we're either reconstructing it or we're changing it slightly, elaborating it to work on that. And so one of the final things is like a complex skill. For me in climbing, there's quite a few things like that. One of the easiest things I find to do a whole part whole is teaching dynos. I can teach the takeoff, sorry, the setup, the takeoff, and the landing are the three things. And if you try and get them to do it all at once, it's very complicated. But again, breaking it down, you then need to bring them back together and go back to the whole skill. Again, beginners are often require this whole part whole thing a lot more than an expert. An expert might be able to just use their greater knowledge of the thing to get through it. So in terms of how people are learning, we've got like a conscious learner. They're literally having to think through anything. This is going to be your beginner. You know, you're teaching them how to belay, and it's just like you've just gone like, you've got to take the rope in, you've got to, you know, and their head is everywhere. And from going through this, you know, I pull down on this rope, push up on this rope, lock the rope down, and move this hand down, this hand back up, and this hand back here, and then I take in the rope again. They'll go from that to an associative learner, which might be taking lock of hand swap. So three things, and then it'll just be belaying. And so as people move through this, they, you know, conscious learner has to break through. I think the associative learner is starting to chunk and associate information together, and the autonomous learner is basically able to do something without really thinking about it. In terms of like for people that drive or ride a push bike, there's probably times where, and this is what somebody that's autonomous in a skill will happen, is that you will get somewhere, you would have driven somewhere, you would have ridden somewhere, and you will not remember indicating, changing gear, because actually you're just driving a car now. You're not having to like associate everything. And so that is, if you like, the stages of learning, you know, we go from thinking everything through to starting to chunk everything to basically almost being on autopilot. In terms of those stages, the person at the beginning, the conscious learner, wants serious practice, in that we want to get them into the ballpark of what we're looking. Until we've got them into the ballpark, they can't start to chunk and associate stuff. So then we move on to this random, varied, and augmented. And then we want just random and augmented and trying to throw things at them to perform without thinking. So again, this is for people that may be going through this, that want to, you know, if you think about basically what you've ever taught in climbing, go back and look at these practices and think when and where have you used them? Have you used them appropriately? Could you use them in different forms? You know, effectively what you want to do, hopefully after you've seen this, is to go through and reflect on what you've learned and how you could maybe change your actual teaching practice. The final thing that I've clumped together as part of this was, you know, observation, analysis, and feedback, in that I kind of think they all need to be together, because in order to give feedback, we have to have observed a behavior we want to rectify. We've had to analyze it, and then we've got to give it back. If we don't observe something, we want to be in the right place at the right time. So when you're climbing, sometimes that is, I want to be head on. Sometimes I want to be side on, depending on what I'm looking at, whether it's and I might see their body coming out from the wall. I might see them too much lateral movement, too little lateral movement. Um, and so getting yourself in the right place to observe and do that over a period of time. So if I look around and somebody's doing a boulder problem and I see them do one thing, they double tap a foot once, but the rest of the time they're fine, that's a one-off. I want to see mistakes that are recurring, in order so that I know it's an issue rather than just a one-off. So often that could be, we need the good observation skills. So some people like to use phones or cameras to help video them and give them more time to feedback. Again, there are issues with that because filming people can put people under pressure. The other advantage is to have knowledge of common mistakes and errors, and you need to be able to determine a symptom from a cause. And so what I mean by that is I might have a client that is struggling with, they just get pumped all the time on a route. And, they might go, actually, I need to work on my endurance because my strength endurance, because I'm just getting pumped. And actually, it might be because they are, they have got bad technique. And so actually, I need to be able to determine whether it is a physical issue or it's a technique issue. And actually, what is the actual root cause rather than so the symptom would be I get pumped on a route. The cause could be multiples of things, and you need to determine what that is. So you then need to combine your observation analysis to come up with a method to correct the problem. They kind of say avoid, that was good, but, because people always forget what comes before the but. The reality is that generally when we're trying to coach people, we are trying to get rid of bad stuff. So we do have to say, oh, that was good, but we're just focusing on that. A lot of people say the post sandwich, good, bad, good. Some people say you could just go bad and then good. It's up to you. And then think about the learner. Could they benefit through the feedback visually, audio, or kinesthetically? Are you going to show them, talk to them, get them to do it themselves? Sometimes when I'm teaching belaying, I go in front of them and I grab their hands and I actually guide their hands through it. So that would be some form of kinesthetic feedback. But you need to decide what is best for not only the client, but maybe the activity you're doing. And then as a learner progresses through from that, conscious through associative to autonomous, how we give that feedback changes. So a beginner won't know if I go, you seem to be struggling with that belaying. What do you think the problem is? They aren't going to have a clue because they're total beginners. They've got nothing to base that idea from. Whereas if I asked an expert, oh, what's wrong with your belaying with this device? They would have some experience of belaying and maybe different devices, and they might be able to give me the answers. And so we often say the beginners, you need to feedback through directly telling them and direct interventions, whereas the more expert, we can often use probing questions to help them reach the issues themselves. And that is kind of it. Let's just go to here. So if you'd like me to send you a copy of this, what you need to do is, I'm pretty sure nobody's watching live, and I'm pretty sure nobody's ever going to get to the end, so I'm pretty sure I'm safe for this. I just want you to go and sign up to my WhatsApp, like my Facebook page, and say, hi Mark, I'd really like a copy of North Wales Climb, and I will send this one. I might even sign it if you want me to. I do joke that the ones that I sign are worth less than the ones that aren't signed. But yeah, if you've got through to this far, you probably deserve the guidebook. But yeah, you need to sign up on the server is the Vertical Live server. I will put a link in the comments below this on the few places where it's being showed, and hopefully